Post-World War II duopoly. Arnold Mayer's characteristic of post-World War II civil strife and revolution in the global south and interaction between the USSR and the West in the arena as a global civil war is accurate to an extent, but at best it was far less than one in the years immediately after World War I. In many ways, it will make more sense to identify the anti-colonial struggle of the global south as a primary axis of conflict with the USSR, giving limited and opportunistic support to those struggling, carry little risk, and otherwise opposing them. The relationship between the two post-war superpowers was at least as much collusive as competitive, while the orientation of the United States towards revolutionary change was almost uniformly reactive or repressive. The USSR's backing for revolutionary change was cautious at best, even when the Revolutionary Party was not controlled by Moscow, and grudgingly hostile when it was either instigated by actors outside Soviet control or threat to the USSR desire for a community with the West. Examples before, during, and debatably not long after World War II, non-anarchist socialists had supported and collaborated with fascists on multiple occasions. For example, the first fascist state, the Free State of Fume, which is the only example of a quote-unquote left-wing or quote-unquote anarcho-fascist state, was only recognized by the USSR. It was controlled basically by rapists, and it was basically criminal gangs and pirates. And the same thing with the Social Democratic Party of Germany, who joined forces with the fascists to take down the revolutionary communists in the German Revolution, or various left-wing factions, quote-unquote left-wing, within fascist parties before being persecuted, like the straighter faction of the Nazi parties, the National Syndicalist factions of the Italian fascists, the Left Kuomintang for the Kuomintang party, and to a lesser extent the Japanese Cherry Blossom Society wanted a state socialism. But they did clarify that they don't want actual socialism, they want the state socialist style of the USSR, but with capitalism, even though the USSR was state capitalist. Or the left Kuomintang joined forces with the fascist Japan, or Stalin wanted to be the fourth Axis power before Hitler's betrayal, or many cases where fascists and Marxists joined forces to crush anarchists in Spain, or monarchists as well in Spain, Ukraine, and Korea, etc. Or Nazis and communists joined forces in the Weimar Republic during the Weimar Republic in many occasions, or even the communist faction of the Zionist movement joining forces with the Nazi for the transfer agreement. Or, if the Bolshevik model of vanguardism and centralized, approach to organizational struggle was actually gave the foundation. It became a model for fascist organizations. In the words of Nikolai Bukharin in the 12th Congress of the Communist Party in 1923, describing the Italian fascists, and I quote, adopted and applied in practice the experience of the Russian revolutions in terms of their methods in the advantage of combat. In fact, if one regards them from the formal point of view, that is, from a point of view of the technique of their political methods, then one discovers in them a complete application of Bolshevist tactics, in the sense of rapid concentration of force and energetic action of tightly structured military organizations. Or, in the words of Leon Trotsky, Benito Mussolini stole from the Bolsheviks, and Hitler imitated the Bolsheviks and Mussolini. Or the Leninist philosopher Tony Cliff analyzed of Lenin's approach to one-man management. And I quote, on the number and effective methods of disrupting the unity of workers as class, one of the most important of these is the fostering of competition between workers by means of piecework system. He added that these were used by the Nazis and the Stalinists for the same purpose. End quote. Or in 1931, as stated by Ian McKay, the birth of the Second Spanish Republic to 1933, the socialists had been in coalition government with the Republicans and attacked the anarchists, more specifically the CNT, and repeated in many ways of the UGT's collaboration with the quasi-fascist Primo de Rivera dictatorship of 1923 to 1930. Laws were passed with socialist help, making lightning strikes illegal and state arbitration or compulsory. The Irish Socialist Republic had started their own civil war, and for their own power, and many areas controlled by the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, became basically gangs. Or in the words of Miriam Rosso Bernard, and I quote, thus the Bolsheviks entered a commercial agreement with Mussolini's fascist government soon after he assumed power in Italy. On the morning after the murder of the socialist deputy Matteotti, the Soviet ambassador called on Mussolini. At the very same time, when the German communists were planning to overthrow the state, the Russian government was not only making trade agreements with the German capitalist government, but even making secret arrangements whereby the Germans could invade the military terms of the Treaty of Versailles by establishing arms factories and treating armies on Russian soil. Wherever clash occurred, the claims of Soviet foreign policy prevailed over the needs of the revolutionary class struggle. End quote. Or, during the summer 1923, joint meetings were held in both communist and fascist speakers urged an alliance with Soviet Russia against the Entente powers. So for several months, the German communist workers with the Nazis, and going so far as stage rallies and share podiums together. The communist leader, Ruth Fischer, even argued that, and I quote, he who denounced Jewish capital is already a warrior in the class war, even though he does not know it. End quote. This until the Nazis' leadership placed a ban of further cooperation. Carry on, I'm just saying. As Noam Chomsky described the Cold War, putting second order complexity aside, it was for the USSR primarily a war against its satellites, and for the US a war against the Third World. For each, it has served to entrench a particular system of domestic privilege and coercion. Mutual relations between the powers were, to a largely unrecognized degree, cooperative, and they served to justify each other's domestic system of power and to facilitate each other's control in their respective sphere of interest. The USSR and the division of the post-war during World War II itself, Stalin was hopeful for a collaboration post-war relationship with the United States and Great Britain, with the comments of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. Stalin shifted from colonial struggle against the British, French, and Dutch colonial authorities by communists in Asia and the Pacific, este, to demanding their subordinate anti-colonial struggle to their support to the Western war effort. And I quote, the anti-imperial struggle and the anti-fascist struggle, therefore, tend to be pulled in opposite directions. Thus, Stalin pact with the Germans in 1939, which disrupted the Western left, allowing Indian or Vietnamese communists to concentrate happily on opposing the British and French, whereas the German invasion of the USSR in 1941 forced them, as good communists, to put the defeat of the Axis first, i.e., to put the liberation of their own country much lower on the agenda. This was not merely unpopular, but strategically senseless at the time, when the colonial empires of the West were at their most vulnerable, if not actually collapsing. Vladimir Sobuk, in the history of the Cold War, incorporated newly opened Soviet archives citing correspondence between Molotov and Stalin. Hitler attacked on the USSR June 22, 1941, and the Japanese attack on the United States on December 7, 1941, brought the two nations together for the first time. Even as the Nazis were advancing to the banks of the Volga, Roosevelt invited the Soviets to become core organizer of the post-war security community. The American president told Molotov in Washington in negotiating in late May 1942 that it would be necessary to create an international police force in order to prevent war in the next 25 to 30 years. After the war, Roosevelt continued, the victors, the US, England, USSR, must keep their armaments. Germany and its satellites, Japan, France, Italy, Romania, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, must be disarmed. Roosevelt, four policemen, the United States, the United Kingdom, the USSR, and China, who had to preserve peace by force. This unusual offer took Molotov by surprise, but after 2 days, Stalin instructed him to announce to Roosevelt without delay that he was absolutely correct. In his summary of the Soviet-American talks in 1942, Stalin highlighted an agreement with Roosevelt and the establishment after the war of international military force to prevent aggression. Roosevelt's friendliness to the Soviets in Tehran and Yalta seemed to reveal his desire to secure a lasting partnership after the war. But Gabriel Kolko noted that Stalin's euphemistic willingness to abandon communist-led resistance forces and sacrifice their gain in U.S. and British-occupied Axis territory predate not only Yalta, but Churchill's cocktail napkin sketch of spheres of influence in Moscow that previous fall. In 1944, the Soviet Union approved the imposition of a conservative regime in Allied-occupied Italy, and from that time the repeated endorsed Anglo-American politician initiates in those places applying protest to them. An irony is in Italy after World War II, when they tried to establish the new government, one of the first people in the Supreme Court were communists, and these Marxists were the same one who released all the fascists who were responsible for war crimes. Basically, no consequences. For the fascists in Italy suffer no consequences thanks to the communist help. The irony. Stalin and the Soviet foreign policy established expected Roosevelt to be reasonable about a combination the USSR ensuring strategic sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and believed the US-Soviet cooperation, despite possible problems, would continue after the war. Molotov considered it both profitable and important to preserve the wartime alliance with the United States, and Litvinov considered it the main task of post-war Soviet policy to manage good relations with both London and Washington and prevent the coalescence of the United States and UK into anti-Soviet blocs. Este, it also see in greater detail the Western Allies established a capitalist provisional government in liberating Axis territory, often overseen by former Axis collaborators, and forcibly dispossessed leftist anti-fascist resistance movements from their gains on the ground. But they did so with the willing cooperation of Stalin, who, for the sake of maintaining a post-war partnership with Roosevelt and Churchill, was quite happy to throw Western European communists under the bus and ordered them to submit, even when they might possibly be able to hold on to power against US and British opposition. Kolko raised the question as to why there was less chance in Southern and Western Europe after World War IV, 1944, when armed resistance forces might feel immense vacuum to discredit traditional conservative classes created because of so many of them were collaborators and fascists. Why in such a context there was no serious political crisis in any European country where the masses were radicalized, save Greece, reveals a great deal about the nature of the objectives of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party, as well as the origins of the long peace in Europe that has begun to erode dramatically since the demise. He elaborated on last very subjective clause of this quote by first asking whether the very existence of the Soviet Union itself as a hegemony over the communist parties indeed sparked the remainder of Europe by basically political and social challenges they might have confronted, challenge comparable to the far greater dangers US rulers faced at the much less destructive wars of 1914 and 1948. Specifically, owing to his hostility to anything not subject to his absolute control, Stalin exerted a powerful restraining force to Western Communist parties, whose new mass members were considerably more radical and unpredictable than their leaders. Given the overall balance of forces in Greece, Italy, and France after 1943, the left was closer to attaining power at the dominant power in at least two of these nations than at any other time before since. The vast number who entered communists and other parties were not deeply indoctrinated or disciplined ideologically, but the communists' real problem was not the possible weakness their masses committed made late in the war, which communist writers later cite to exonerate their party's passivity at this crucial moment, notwithstanding the reality that in the main, if not exclusive reason for the restraint was Stalin's policy. The principal challenge confronting Stalin and his anointed leaders was to prevent the enormous number who were ruled from acting autonomously of the party line, which is precisely what they did in Greece when reprisal left them no alternative. For the communists at least, the greatest threat inherent in large memberships under tight elite control was the possibility of losing absolute mastery of their party's organization. Had the communists not exited or not played the role of a anodyne for social discontent, then there certainly would have been many more strikes and social conflicts, and quite possibly more truly revolutionary challenges in southern and western Europe than the one in Greece. Elsewhere, again, he stressed the central role of the Communist parties facilitate the restoration of capitalist rule in Western Europe. During the critical period 1944 to 1947, the Russians gave the Western European social system a reprieve during which to consolidate its power. The United Front strategy was the key to Communist political policy everywhere from 1943 to 46, and well beyond then in France and Italy as well. The only time the left posed a true threat to Anglo-American interests occurred when the Russians did not fully control it or when the breaking down of local social order was too complete that even the communists could not prevent a sharp response from the masses. After the war, many of the militants and communist movement who directed the leadership of the resistance found official conservatism uncomfortable, and the pattern of internal purges from within post-war communist parties followed the division between the theocratic conservatives and ex-resistance militants, often depending on who spent the war in Moscow or in home country. In Western Europe, the communists worked for elements of stability that reinforced the old order, no strikes, high production, and the like, and in fact took genuine pride in their very substantial administration aid in restoring the old order in a refurbished form. Capitalism survived only where the communists and social democrats were instrumental in reforming it. Elsewhere, upheaval and collapse ensued, and Anglo-Americans and their allies had to apply sheer force against revolutionary responses of the people. In this sense, the left became the savior of Western European capitalism. Kolko raised the question of what would happen to Europe after the Axis defeat had Stalin not exited it. To mention Tito's independent Yugoslav communism as an example of the kinds of movement that might have come to power in Eastern Europe, as well as confronting the Western allies in Greece, Italy, and France. In short, Stalin and Western communist leaders who pledged allegiance to him desired disciplined party organization under their centralized control, not in order to wield them as instrument of revolution, but to restrain any revolutionary activity by their membership. Stalin and Western Communist Party arguably performed a function analogous of that of official union leadership under the Wagner/NRRB regime in the United States, of enforcing capitalist control against any potential direct action of the rank and file. According to Harma, the agreement at Tehran, Potsdam, and Yalta on the division of sphere of influence between the USSR and the West and the Western allies of Europe were a death blow to those hopes of resistance movements and gave Stalin's army a free hand in Eastern Europe. Stalin was not going to let communists elsewhere upset the arrangement by attempting to lead revolutions. However favorably the mass of the people might be, his former foreign minister Litvinov spelled out bluntly to the U.S. representative in Italy in September 1944, "We do not want revolution in the West." This was not just a matter of words. In the spring of 1944, the Italian communist leader Togliatti had returned to Italy from Moscow. He announced that his party was joining the despised but the government and was prepared to leave the monarchy untouched until the war was over. The French leader, Maurice Desroses, insisted from Moscow that the biggest resistance group, the communist-led FDP, should integrate into accepting the leadership of the goal of smaller FFI. Unlike this situation, other communist parties in Western Europe, the Italian Communist Party found itself taking second place in the resistance to the Socialist Party, untainted by any collaboration with the fascist regime. The Communist Party was, as a result, not only quite small but also more militant than is likely to have been absent the need to compete with the Socialists. It only underwent rapid expansion from 1943 on and then surpassed the Socialists in leadership until 1946. It's a matter of only months that the PCI went from being an unquestionable but disciplined Leninist sect to a mass party comprised of members whose future conduct was still unpredictable. With the Allied victory in Italy, the PSI, forbidden by Stalin to engage in insurrection, continued to organize itself as a mass party with a goal of achieving power electorally. They suppressed all ideological and class criteria for membership. There were no barrier for religious faith or philosophical convictions, and their December 1945 platform defended private property, religious freedom, and the family. But although its dream of becoming a party for all classes, the overwhelming majority of its members still came from urban working class and poor rural elements. The average communist was in brief far from being a heavily indoctrinated, carefully screened revolutionary, but more likely to be part of a local social human network that shared general political goals and a very personal arrangement that endured all sorts of vicissitudes caused both the party and its border to increase over the future years. Aside from the very militant force of its membership in the until recently German-occupied North, the nature and strength of ideological commitment of most PSCI members in March 1945 are difficult to discern. Stalin policy persisted in the late 1940s to the extent dissuading the PSI from any attempt insurrectionary seizure of power, even if a communist electoral victory were overturned. While in Berlin, crises were brewing. The imminent victory in the Italian Communist Party, or PCI, in April 1948 threatened the balance of power in Europe. Historian Victor Salavatsky has found ample evidence that the militants of PCI were prepared, if necessary, to seize power by means of military insurrection. Their leader, Palmiro Togliatti, schooled in Stalinist realism, however, had great doubts about the outcome of such an adventure. On March 23, he gave use a secret channel to send a letter to Stalin, asking for advice. He warned the Kremlin leader that PCI military confrontation with the opposing political camp could lead to a big war. Togliatti informed Stalin that in the case of a civil war in Italy, the United States, Great Britain, and France would support the anti-communist side. The PCI would need the assistance of the Yugoslav army and the forces of other Eastern European countries in order to maintain its control over northern Italy. Togliatti's letter invoked an immediate response from Stalin. He instructed the PCI not to use armed insurrection for any reason to seize power in Italy. Hobsbawm similarly observed that except in their Balkan guerrilla strongholds, the communists made no attempt to stabilize revolutionary regimes. The communist revolutionary actions made in Yugoslavia, Albania, and later China were made against Stalin's advice. The Soviet view was that both internationally and within each country, post-war politics should continue within the framework of an all-embracing anti-fascist alliance. Look forward to long-term coexistence, or rather symbiosis, of capitalist and communist systems, and further social and political change, presumably occurring by shift within democracy for a new type will emerge out of wartime coalition. This optimistic scenario soon disappeared into the night of the Cold War, so completely that few members that started urged the Yugoslav communists to keep the monarchy, or that in 1945 British communists were opposed to the breakup of the Churchill wartime coalition, i.e. the electoral campaign which was to bring the Labour government to power. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that Stalin meant all of this seriously and tried to prove it by dissolving the Comintern in 1943 and the Communist Party of America in 1944. Stalin's decision expressed in the words of our American Communist leader that we will not raise the issue of socialism in such a form and manner as to endanger or weaken unity made his intentions clear. For practical purposes, as this is revolutionary recognized, it was a permanent goodbye to world revolution. Socialism could not be confined to the USSR, and they are assigning particular negotiation as its zone of influence, i.e., basically they occupied by the Red Army at the end of the war. Even within the zone of influence, it could remain an undefined prospect of the future rather than immediate program for the new people's democracy. History will take little notice of policy intentions when another way, except in one respect. The division of the globe, or large part of it, into two zones of influence, negotiated in 1944 to 45, remained stable. Neither side overstepped the line dividing them from more merely for 50, 30 years. Both withdrew with open confrontation, thus guaranteed that the Cold War wars never become hot ones. Indeed, in 1945 to 47, where Moscow controlled its client regimes and communist movement, these were specifically committed to not building states on the model of the USSR, but mixed economies of the multi-party parliamentary democracy, which were specified distinguished from dictatorship of the proletariat. Still more of a single party that were described in inter-party documents as neither useful nor necessary. The only communist regime that refused to follow this line were those whose revolutions, actively discouraged by Stalin, escaped from Moscow's control. An example, Yugoslavia. Of course, the dominance of communists in the anti-fascist resistance meant that when the Allied occupation's regime collapsed, they were in the physical opposition to determine the successor's regime. When the German army was finally defeated with a variety of contributions for local resistance movement, the regime of occupying or fascist Europe disintegrated and social revolutionary regimes under communist control took over or attempted to take over in several countries where armed resistance been most effective: Yugoslavia, Albania, and put forth the British and eventually US-backed military support in Greece. Technically speaking, the entirety of the Balkans, let's be honest. Este, but Stalin was entirely willing to be deprived from the advantages of this position when it suited his interests. In 1944, he made abundantly clear to the ELAS resistance that could receive no Soviet aid, and the British-backed government in exile in Kharkiv has his entire support. Indeed, Russian diplomats privately asked Churchill why he put up with Elas to borrow a line from Animal Farm If you have your lower animals contend with, we have our lower classes. And at Yalta, he responded to Churchill's repression of communist guerrillas in Greece with, I have every confidence in British policy in Greece. After repression by the right-wing governments resulting in civil war in the late 1940s, Stalin refused any support to the guerrillas. When Yugoslavia's Tito and Bulgaria's Dmitry backed them, Stalin summoned them in early 1948 and angrily demanded they cease their support as an impossible challenge to Anglo-American regional interests, successfully in this case of Dmitry, but not to Tito. Yugoslavia was shortly thereafter expelled by the Comintern, finalizing the USSR-Yugoslav schism. In response to critique there at any attention of power by Greek revolutionary forces who had been feasible in any case, Kolko argued that American Britain, who had not forcefully overcome mass revolutionary action in Greece and Italy without jeopardizing their entire anti-German war effort, and that domestic publics would not have supported such intervention. But could such a revolutionary movement have taken power given the presence of massive Anglo-American armies? Communist writers have frequently argued that it would have been impossible, but such skeptical judgment entirely disregard the large context of the war with Germany. The purely military problems involved as well as formidable political difficulties that sustained counter-revolutionary wars we had encountered both England and the US. It would have been entirely possible for French partisans to impose their control in central western France following the Allied advances in mid-1944, and any Allied the effort to displace them from power would require the diversion of American and British troops from the anti-German offensives. At the time, when it was Germany was able to mount a serious counteroffensive in the Ardennes as late as December, American and British generals would quite likely have opposed such a move. Would have it would have been Stalin to occupy more of Germany in the meantime. Likewise, had ELAS decided to forcibly resist British eviction from the territory they controlled in Greece, would have required a much larger contingent of British troops and undermined their war effort against Germany. In words, there was ample reason to believe they have armed left been ready to take power in these nations, who have been succeeded in part, if not entirely, for at least an indefinite period. Their potential for remaining power was at least as great as the one in Bolshevik in 1917. For the domestic political opposition would have been more formidable than even the military hazards. To convince British and American publics, or the troops themselves, of the need for diverting troops from the war against Germany to put down anti-Axis resistance movements and to replace them with fascist collaborators and monarchists would have been extremely difficult. Successful revolutionary actions by autonomous communists in Greece, Italy, and perhaps France would have been presented not only FDR and Churchill, but Stalin with their worst nightmares of leftist Western independence, both of Western and Soviet influence. Perhaps almost as much of his cynical opportunism and desire for European condominium with America and Britain, Kolko argued the Stalin abandonment of ELAS reflected his fear of any revolutionary force not subject to his complete control. It was at least as important to Stalin to profoundly mistrust the distinctive leftist combination that had emerged in Greece. Its enthusiasm and creativity, its mass-based and local intuitive, and all those independent attributes, and the lack of total internal discipline he sought to expunge from communist parties everywhere in Europe so as better to control them. Even after the onset of the Cold War in 1946, Stalin pressured the Greek Communist Party, or the KKE, to participate in the British provisional government's rigged election and lend legitimacy to the regime. The KKE leadership, to no avail and its turnout, appeased both Stalin and Churchill by recognizing Greece as in British sphere of influence and asking many to participate as a legal party in a unified front government. It went so far to limit itself to calling for public order following the Nazi withdrawal and persuade ELAS guerrilla to stay outside Athens and let British forces occupy the capital. In France, Stalin followed the same pattern. He pursued cordial relations with the Gaulists from 1942 and on, and loyal back his goal and post-war power in Europe to greater extent than Roosevelt did. He sternly rebuked any communist, though, of taking power unilaterally, and assured the Gaulists in 1942 that he would not incite the French to create a communist regime. And as the US and Britain attempt to come to an agreement between themselves on the composition of the post-war provisional government in France, Stalin assured them in Auver's Hardeman's book that it was Soviet policy to leave the initiative in French policy to the British and ourselves, i.e. the United States, after the liberation of Paris, started to continue to warn the Communist Party not to interfere with orders from the Gauland or from Western allies. Stalin's willingness to sacrifice foreign communists for the sake of friendly relations with the West held true in Asia as well. In China, Stalin distanced himself from Mao Zedong in order to cement his relationship with the nationalist regime, aka the fascists, and forced the Chinese Communist Party to agree to a truce with the nationalists in order to preserve his partnership with the United States. The USSR and Cold War lockdown over the Communist bloc. As the Soviet army advances into Eastern Europe, Stalin initially pursued a pluralistic approach to a provisional government established in liberated countries. This was especially true in the case of Czechoslovakia, where pre-war President Edvard Beneš maintained an excellent relation with Stalin, who was the first major power to recognize his London government in exile in 1941. Beneš repeatedly blamed the West's inordinate fear of the Soviet Union and communism for the failure to stop Hitler in 1939, and stressed the need for a realistic understanding between Western allies and the USSR if post-war Europe were to be effectively stabilized. As Soviet troops prepared to enter Czechoslovakia in 1944, Stalin was the only Allied leader to sign a civil affairs agreement with Beneš's exile regime, promised not to interfere in Czech internal affairs. In April 1945, as the exiled government returned Czechoslovakia, Beneš gave the Communist Party 7 of the 25 ministries in the government. The CP leader, Klement Kotwal, was a national communist rather than a Stalinist, and was highly rated as a sketch patriot by the London exile community. As Allied goodwill began to break down in 1949, the Soviet Union made it clear that should the Western power refuse to accept neutrality, Czechoslovakia would of necessity be expected to ally with the USSR. Czechoslovakia and Finland were outliers on the most liberal side of the Soviet Eastern European policy, but multi-party democracy. In Czechoslovakia ended only in 1947, following several years of neutralism under left-oriented coalition government as part of the larger process of lockdown and Sovietization in Eastern Europe, a casualty of Cold War tension. In the aftermath of Hiroshima, Stalin began to focus increasingly on the need to secure Soviet control of Eastern Europe as military buffers against the West. And sorry, I was about to sneeze for a moment. Kroskov's son, Anatoly cites his father as recalling that Hiroshima set the heads of the Soviet military spinning. The mood in the Kremlin and the general staff was neurotic, and mistrust towards the Allies grew quickly. Opinions floated around to preserve a large land army, to establish control over extended territory, to lessen potential losses from atomic bombings. In other words, atomic bombing of Japan may once again reappear in many of the entire Eastern European beachheads for the USSR. The new assertiveness of the United States after Hiroshima, which by the way was state-sponsored terrorism, was completely unjustified to drop the bomb because Japan was all ready to surrender and they were losing to begin with. The difference between a world without bombing and without dropping the nukes with the world that is, like if they never drop the nukes, the war only will last 1 week longer. That's it. It was completely unjustified. It was basically a gross tax display of dominance. And this new display of of forcement that indicate Moscow that America wanted to challenge the Soviet control over Central Europe and the Balkans. From that moment on, the issue for Stalin was not so much the presence of American military power in Germany, but rather the maintenance of Soviet military presence in Central Europe, above all in the Eastern Zone. Stalin openness to fully Sovieticize the occupation regimes in Eastern Europe increased in 1945. After Western allies toughened their line against the Soviet Union, on August 2021, British and American representatives informed the Romania King and Bulgaria regent, along with the Soviet occupation officials, they would not recognize the new government in those countries unless representatives of pro-Western parties were allowed to participate in elections. They also encouraged domestic opposition to resist in the expectation of Western support. Stalin seeing this as atomic diplomacy in the immediate aftermath of the Japanese Parliament, ordered the Soviet military authorized to hold the line and make no alterations in the composition of the new Bulgarian government. Stalin's refusal to budge resulted in American recognition of the Bulgarian regime in order to avoid appointment token position figure to minor cabinet posts. The pressure towards Sovietization intensified in 1948 in response to the Marshall Plan. Stalin had been considerably strengthening his control over European Communist parties since 1946, but the establishment of the Comintern was accelerated by the Marshall Plan. It reflected Stalin's conviction that from now on, the Soviet could manage Central Europe only with iron ideological and party discipline. The Communist Party had to renounce national roles to socialism. They quickly became Stalinized and rigidly subordinated to Kremlin policies. The opposition of Stalin's control led to the purge of Tito's Yugoslavia. This was particularly true of Soviet-occupied zones in Germany, where Sovietization proceeded apace. Stalin's reading of the Marshall Plan left no room for German neutrality. The rapid consolidation of the Soviet bloc in Central Europe brought about great changes in Soviet policy in Germany. They shifted decisively toward the creation of the Soviets East Germany and the expense of the campaign for German unity. This did not allow the SED, a union of the Communist Social Democratic parties, which Stalin has encouraged as a vehicle for pursuing an electoral road to socialism, to become member of the Comintern. Yet the SED leaders, including the former Social Democrats, expressed unequivocal loyalty to the Soviet Union and denounced the Marshall Plan. In the fall of 1947, Stalin pushed the East German Communist leadership to organize military formations under the auspices of the German Directorate of the Interior, the police apparatus in the Soviet zone. In November 1947, a Department of Intelligence and Information that was set up inside the Directorate of the Interior with the goal of detecting and uprooting by extra-legal methods any opposition to the East German regime. In the rest of Eastern Europe, likewise, the USSR followed suit by eliminating the non-communists from their multi-party people's democracies, or henceforth reclassified as dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e. communist parties. In Asia, Stalin responded to the same atomic diplomacy by playing the CCP against Xi'an government in Manchuria, seeking an agreement with China that would cement the Soviet position in Manchuria and prevent the penetration of US-Japanese alliance onto the mainland. When Xi'an broke off talks under U.S. pressure, which by the way was Xi'an was part of the left Kuomintang faction, you know, the left faction within the fascist party of the Kuomintang, just like Stalin gave Mao a green light to expand his attacks to the major cities. Although they did so with caution and usually some reluctance, Stalin and subsequent Soviet leadership show a willingness, in the last resort, to maintain Leninist regimes in power in Eastern Europe by force if necessary. Although Eastern European uprisings against pro-Soviet regimes were commonly framed in the West as being anti-socialist, the closest approach to an accurate generalization would be to characterize them as libertarian socialists, as the recuperating Marxist notion of workers' empowerment against anti-democratic and anti-workers authorities. This was nowhere more evident in 1953 uprising of the Soviet occupation zone in Germany, were sparked by an increase in work norms. As Chris Harma points out, the participants were anything but right-wing. The section of the workers who struck those would those have been on the most left-wing during the Weimar Republic of the 1920s. Some 68% of those purchased for the Communist Party in East Berlin for taking part in the rising had been members before Hitler's rise to power. They were all militants who saw the rising as a continuation struggle for workers' control to which they had dedicated their youth. Indeed, workers at the Stalin Alley construction project responded to placate attempts by Minister of Mines Silpo by taunting, "We are the real communists, not you." In 1946, the Soviet leadership went through a scares over Kulka's Polish road to socialism, but managed to bring him back into line without military intervention. Beginning in late 1956, Poland had become a hotbed of unrest in Soviet bloc. The collective leadership, despite the recent reconciliation with Tito's Yugoslav, viewed the Soviet Polish road to socialism as the beginning of the end of the Warsaw Pact, and their internal discussion. The Presidium member used the same language as Pravat used, the Western imperials seek to separate us, using the language of national roles, and defeated one by one. With the aim of propping up the loyal Polish communists, the Presidium agreed to remove the Soviet KGB advisor from Polish security organs and provide economic assistance to the Polish state. But the experience in the GDR in 1953 was fresh on his mind. The Kremlin concerned turned into panic on October 19, 1956, when it learned that the Polish communists were coming in plenum without any conciliation with Moscow to replace Edward Oka as their leader with Władysław Gomulka, who had been expelled from the Polish United Workers' Party, the Communist Party of Poland, and imprisoned from 1951 to 54 for nationalist deviations. At the same time, Polish leadership demanded that Soviet advisors in the Polish army also leave, as well as Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, the Soviet citizen of Polish descent who had been appointed by Stalin as Polish Minister of Defense. Khrushchev and other Kremlin potentates immediately flew to Warsaw to attempt to bully Komka and his Polish colleagues with tough words and raw power, using to press the Soviet troops on Polish soil. The Kremlin dedicated return home on October 20 in an agitated mood. On that day, Presidium concluded that the remaining solution to determine what's going on in Poland. The notes of Vladimir Manny at this point became explicitly cryptic, but it's probable that the Kremlin rulers decided to take primary steps to use Soviet troops and replace the Polish leadership after Kowalski was removed from the PUWP Politburo. However, to collect the leadership temporized. Suddenly, Khrushchev suggested tolerance and admitted that military intervention under the circumstances must be cancelled. Presidia unanimously agreed. The main reason for the uprising must have been Komko's speech. Planning to the Gremlin delegation left Poland has pledged to build socialism and fully obligation to the Warsaw Treaty of Organization. The Soviet intervention in Hungary only after original internal dissension of leadership of the of show to respond. And this is during the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, the only time in history where it was an anarchist revolution who successfully overthrew a Marxist state and it became an anarchist society for 2 months with complete workers' control of the means of production. On October 23, 1956, Budapest and the rest of Hungary rose up against the communist regime. On October 26, both supporters and secret enemies of Khrushchev and the Presidium approved the introduction of Soviet troops into Budapest. On October 30, the Presidium, however, switched to the policy of negotiation and authorized a declaration of principle guiding Soviet relations with other socialist countries. Foreign observers had long considered this declaration a perfidious trick on the part of Moscow, but historians have recently learned that this declaration resulted from the complex debate and the Presidium that ended with a decision to forego the use of military force in Hungary. The failure of the first indecisive use of Soviet troops to extinguish the uprising in Budapest and a number of casualties tipped the scales from Budapest. Mikoya and the President's appeal adversary defended the policy of negotiation and compromise with consistency and courage. Mikhail Sulzvo, another emissary, was applied to do the same. Suko and Malakov supported the withdrawal of troops. The proposal to leave Hungary alone split the Presidium. Bugani, Molotov, and Voroshivo and Kaganovich defended the Soviet right to interfere in the affairs of fraternal parties. This, of course, meant the Soviet military force could be used to restore communist regimes. Then foreign military Shevchenko delivered an eloquent speech in favor of withdrawal. He said that the scourge of events revealed the crisis in our relations with countries of people's democracy, anti-Soviet elements are widespread in Central Europe, and therefore the declaration should be only the first step towards elimination of the elements of diktat between the Soviet Union and other members of the Warsaw Pact. Suko, Ekaterina, and Fortseva, and Matvei Saburov spoke one after another in favor of withdrawal. The non-interventionist momentum was reversed in the following day, October 31st, when the Presidium voted the same unanimously to order Marshal Ivan Konet to prepare for decisive military intervention in Hungary. Some scholars have attributed this starting flip-flop to external events, above all, reports of the crucial lynchings of communists in Hungary. Kumskov's fear that the collapse of communism in Hungary would cause Poland to be the next, and the Franco-British-Israeli aggression against Egypt. There was also a large spillover effect inside the Soviet Union itself, unrest in the Baltics and western Ukraine, and student hunger strikes and demonstrations in Moscow, Leningrad, and other cities. The deciding news that tipped the scale was the declaration by the Hungarian leader Irma Nagy, and this government had decided to remove Hungary from the Warsaw Pact. Contrary to the propaganda line of both Soviet Union and the United States, the Hungary uprising, like prior revolt in Italy, was not an attempt to capital restoration. It was a minimum foreshadowing as Czechoslovakia attempt at socialism with a human face. A decade later, arguably an authentic anarchist revolution. Peter Freyer, who was sent to Hungary by the British Communist Party paper, the Daily Worker, reported, and I quote, the striking resemblance of these committees, the Workers', Peasants, and Soldiers' Council, which grew up in Russia in the 1905 revolution and February 1917. There were once organs of insurrection, the coming together delegates elected in the factories and universities, mines and armies united, and organs of popular self-government which the armed people trusted. A section of the regime tried to gain control of the movement, very much as Concord was doing in Poland, by putting another disgraced communist, Umran Nagai, at the head of the coalition government. On November 4, just as Britain, France, and Israel were attacking Egypt, the Russian tanks swept into Budapest and seized key buildings. They faced bitter armed resistance, which they eventually crushed only by killing thousands, reducing parts of the city to rubble, and driving more than 200,000 to flee across the border into Austria. A general strike paralyzed the city for more than a fortnight, and the Greater Budapest Central Workers' Council fulfilled the role, and in fact, an alternative government to Russia's puppet ruler. Generals got tired, but eventually the Workers' Council were crushed too, and their leader sentenced to years in prison. The official communist line was that the revolution was simply a pro-capitalist fascist escape planned by Western spies. But in so many other cases in the Cold War era, most common account of the revolution in the West was very similar. It claimed that the revolution simply aimed to establish a free society along Western capitalist lines. In fact, most of those who played the leading role in the revolution had wider perspectives. They remembered the pre-war dictatorship who had ruled Hungary in the name of capitalist freedom and look into the different systems which workers' council will play a key role, and even if the speed of events did not give them time to clarify what this system might be, anyone who doubts this will have been various collections of documents from Hungary in 1956 which have been published since. The Prague Spring, of course, was the actual locus of the slogan "Socialism with a human face," has Hamakrikans. These figures in the party forced the president and party secretary Novotiv to resign. Intellectuals and students seized the opportunity to express themselves freely for the first time in 20 years. The whole apparatus of censorship collapsed and police suddenly appeared powerless to crush dissidents. The student formed a free student union. Workers began to vote out state-appointed union leaders. Ministers would grill on television about their policy, and there was a public discussion about the horrors of the Stalin era. Petty Kearney argued that the so-called Prague Spring itself was merely Lucas' attempt to replace the Stalinist party leadership with technocrats. Which mainly mattered was the wave of activism from below, which is invariably unleashed. Secret notes of the role of the Workers' Council in Hungary in 1956. One can only speculate what had happened in Czechoslovakia. Este, in 1968 in the situation that really got out of control. But there are certain hints. Just in 1956 in Hungary, workers' councils began to form and show remarkable resilience in struggle. Also in Hungary, the Soviet leadership hesitated over whether to resort to direct military intervention, but in the end decided in favor. But all archival evidence demonstrates through the Czechoslovakian crisis prevent Poe to avoid extreme measures. That is, military invasion. Instead, he preferred to increase military pressure on Tukbek and Czechoslovak leadership. Pressed for fear that the Soviet invasion would trigger NATO responses, leading to a European war. July 26 to 27, the Politburo, present over by Brezhnev, decided to set provisional state for the invasion of Czechoslovakia. The Soviets continued, however, to negotiate with Dubček and Czechoslovak leadership and tried to bully Sasha Dubček into drastic measures to reverse liberalization and reform. Once all their attempts failed, the Kremlin leaders finally made a decision in August 21, and the forces of the Soviet Union, other countries of the Warsaw Pact, except for Romania, occupied Czechoslovakia. Even so, the letter of passive resistance was that the Soviets were forced to restore the leadership under tight leash and work through them to bring country under control. They expected to be able to crush the dissident overnight, but the immediate effect was to deepen and widen it. There was limited physical resistance to the Russian tanks by enormous passive opposition. Russia was forced to allow the Czechoslovakian government to return home with a promise to bring dissidents under control. This was 9 months interspersed with demonstration strikes. And before his promise was fulfilled, eventually Russia succeeded in imposing a puppet government with silent, overt opposition by driving people from their jobs and in some cases imprisoning them. Stalinist state capitalism was to run Czechoslovakia for another 20 years. Even after the restoration, este, and there were ongoing efforts by the worker to recuperate workers' councils, originally imposed by the state as a control to reform effort into genuine organs of self-management. Even after Tupac announced the discontinuation of workers' council, workers at several enterprises continued to elect them in defiance. In the Soviet Union, Pravda ran an article attacking the very idea of workers' councils as anti-communist propaganda from the imperialist camp. He warned that the demand to hand over enterprises directly to ownership and management of production collectives is particularly dangerous. Anarcho-syndicalism is a step towards corporatism and fractionalism, towards degeneration and capitalism in socialist society. Further, it will undermine the authority of the Communist Party, which is parties are more important, I guess. The Soviet leadership was extremely reluctant to invade Poland in response to destabilization by the Solidarity movement, even as a last resort. Brezhnev knew it would end any hope for a revival of Detente, and even Otropov and Suslov were apprehensive about the consequences. In the end, Brezhnev was able to maneuver Jaruzelski into declaration martial law in order to avoid direct military intervention.